They are an ever-present and many times overlooked character in all modern warfare. Every single combat unit has them, and most combat veterans will always remember them by name, by face, and many times because what they're there to do and what they represent to the combat veteran. What it must be like to be the one person in a combat unit that every person needs at their most critical, but also becomes the one person who, when their name is called out for, sends chills and feelings of angst into the hearts of soldiers. Not because of their personalities or their behavior, as many of them are fondly remembered by their brothers and sisters in arms, but because what they represent and why they're there and why they need to be called upon. Some call them by their names, many are called by the nickname Doc, but we all know them as the combat medic. This episode is dedicated to those who, under the most intense and dangerous of situations, bring aid and comfort to the wounded, and who have to look into the eyes of their dying friends and carry on because that's what they're there to do and the other men need them to. This one's for you, Doc. Welcome to Lessons in Leadership, Band of Brothers. The world was falling apart. Fascist Nazi shock troops of the Third Reich and their blitzkrieg had spread across Europe and northern Africa and were marching their eastern front deep into the heart of Russia. The Empire of Japan was making its conquest of the Pacific reality. 65 million human lives would be lost. 11 million would eventually be systematically exterminated by an evil war machine like the world had never seen before. To gain a foothold into Europe and take on the armies of Hitler's Nazi Third Reich, the world needed a new elite type of soldier. The paratrooper was that soldier. Changing Hearts and Minds welcomes you to a special series dedicated to the greatest generation, and specifically the well-known story that inspired the best-selling book and HBO miniseries, Band of Brothers. Join me, Jeff Adamick, veteran of the U.S. Army where I served as a paratrooper in the 82nd, Ranger in the 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, and finally as a Green Beret in 3rd Special Forces Group, as I welcome fellow veterans, other podcast hosts and personalities, and some very special guests to honor the true story, book, and television series about the greatest generation's most honored story of sacrifice, service, and leadership in the face of overwhelming evil. Lessons in Leadership, the men and history of Easy Company.
When we left for Bastogne, we were short of equipment. We didn't have enough ammunition. We didn't have enough warm clothes. But we had confidence that our higher military authorities would get to us whatever we needed.
And there was a ridge with a tree line. We were dug in on that ridge. Germans knew right where we were, and they really gave us a shellacking.
Well, like in Bastogne, we're down to one round per man there for a while. There's this fog was in, they couldn't resupply us. Every time they tried to drop supplies into us, they missed us and dropped them to the Germans.
One of the guys got hit in the arm with a piece of shrapnel, took his arm off above the elbow. And they were taking him out. He said, "Get my wristwatch off of my arm."
And then a medic came along, and I think he really saved my life because he stuck a syringe in a key position, morphine.
Even today, a real cold night, we go to bed and my wife will tell you that the first thing I'll say is, I'm glad I'm not in Bastogne.
Welcome to Change Your POV and Changing Hearts and Minds production of Lessons in Leadership, Band of Brothers. We, as are in the previous episodes, going to be highlighting a single episode of the legendary HBO miniseries based on the classic book by Stephen Ambrose, Band of Brothers, and highlight characters and their personal histories and actions that made them such a distinct group, and also the unaltered historical facts of the story of our interpretation of the events as they happen. Our co-host this episode is a soon-to-be co-host of a podcast called Conspiracy Geeks. You have heard him before on my Changing Hearts and Minds Halloween episode. Let's do a nice hazing on him and welcome back with me for the first time to this podcast, Nick G. How you doing, Nick?
Pretty good, Jeff. Don't haze me too hard.
Oh, I'm gonna haze the shit out of you because that's what I do.
But no, yeah, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be part of this. When you first brought it up to me, I was really excited for it. This is one of my favorite shows, and as someone who didn't serve in the military, I appreciate you giving me a chance to maybe provide a little bit of a different perspective.
No, it's important, man. It's important to have the perspectives of people who weren't in the military on the show itself too, because 95% of the audience of the show itself is going to be non-military people. I mean, and the book is not written just for military people to remember the story, but it's really written, and the series is made to give an insight into what happens in combat between people from the non-combat experience and the non-military people's point of view. Yeah,
and I'm glad to be on with you, a very well-decorated and well-respected Green Beret.
Oh, God. It sounds so fake, but I know what none of you guys are saying. I know none of you guys are faking it out when you say it, but it does. It sounds. I can't even bring myself to say it because I'm just a fucking clown, to be quite honest with you. So, so before we get into the events of episode 6 of Band of Brothers, which is titled Bastogne, it originally aired on October 7, 2001 on HBO. Let me recap real quick, guys, what happened last episode. Captain Winters leads Easy Company in an attack on what they thought was a machine gun nest, but it turns out to be 2 full companies of German SS who also have artillery support. The attack is successful in that they virtually wipe out the enemy, but they do suffer a couple key casualties. He soon finds himself promoted as the 2nd Battalion's executive officer, and while he has concern about leaving Easy Company, he knows they're in good hands with Lieutenant Moose Heilinger. In the aftermath of the disastrous Operation Market Garden, and with Christmas approaching, the men suddenly find all passes are canceled, and they are quickly moved into Bastogne to help defend the city from a German offensive that is kicked off. The company is now led by Lieutenant Norman Dyke, for whom very few of the men have little respect for. So Nick, we've heard in the other episodes we do like a focus character for each episode. Who is the focus character for this episode specifically?
Yeah, for this episode, the focus character is Eugene Rowe. The nickname's Doc. Now, I know this is one of your favorite episodes. You have a tattoo of the word Doc, don't you?
Yeah, it's Department of Corrections is what it means. I went to jail for murder. No, I'm just kidding. As a lot of you know, I served in the 82nd Airborne Division and 2nd Ranger Battalion as a combat medic. So this episode does does hold a place in my heart because I was a senior line medic and a medic in a company, infantry company, both an airborne and a ranger company for years. So I really understand what goes through Doc Rowe's mind and a lot of this stuff. I did not get to be a combat line medic. I didn't see it, but I was prepared to be, and I did train quite a bit. And I did actually, because of that historical job that I had in the Rangers, I did get called at certain times to treat combat wounded, especially in Iraq, and especially in the invasion of Iraq during the Battle of Debeka Pass. I had been pulled up to treat what was a mass casualty situation, and so I have firsthand experience in seeing what it is like for these guys to go through this stuff. So I do, yeah. So like I said, 10 years as an airborne combat line medic in the 82nd Airborne and 2nd Ranger Battalion. So. But this is not about me. This is about Eugene Rowe. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the backstory and the history of this character?
Eugene Rowe, he's a native of Bayou Chene, Louisiana. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right.
Actually, that sounds good. Sounds good enough to me.
He was born October 17th, 1921. He passed away December 30th of 1998. Luckily, he found out that the show would be made before he passed away, so he knew that it was coming.
Did he know that he was going to be a character on the show?
Yes, he did.
Because I know that one of the things is that this episode is not a story that is told in the book. So even had he read the book, he would not have known that he was going to have an entire episode dedicated pretty much just to him.
Like we said, Rowe was the medic for Easy Company. He was only appointed as a medic because there was a shortage of them, and they were very much needed. He was added to the company in 1943. He was part of Operation Overlord, Operation Market Garden, the Battle of the Ardennes, which this episode is mostly focused on, and the capture of the Eagle's Nest.
Eugene Rowe is played by the actor Shane Taylor. Doc Rowe, as you'll hear the guys call him in the show, is in the background and makes appearances in the other episodes, but the situation that is about to begin was a perfect time to premiere him as a main and a narrative character in the episode. Oh, and much like Winters in the last episode, he is the first person aspect of the episode. You virtually see the entire episode through the eyes of Doc Rowe. Even though it's third person where you're not like seeing it, first person point of view. It's just everything that's done in the show is done in with him as the person who is the observer and the person who is experiencing the episode. So our second character is a little interesting. It's not a member of Easy Company, and it's not a different Army soldier or even a man. It's a woman who was our co-highlighted character. She's a civilian nurse who was volunteering in Bastogne to treat the wounded. She was mentioned briefly in the book, but it was one of the few creative dispatches from the real historical accuracy portion of the thing. There's not even interactions with Doc Rowe. There's no evidence that he ever met her or that the relationship they built between them was even likely. Eugene was married at the time, and so there is a little bit of a weird feeling when you say that, because the show does lend a little bit to maybe a romantic situation between them that may have been building, and it didn't actually happen in the show. But I can only imagine the family must have felt a little uncomfortable about it, considering he was married when he was there. I think it's just some creative license that was taken, and I don't think the family as I've read, I don't think the family was offended, and I think they kind of understood the case. The person I'm talking about is a Belgian nurse, Renée Lamière, played by actress Lucille Jean. Renée Bardonnette Emily Lemaire was born April 10, 1944, in Bastogne, Belgium. She came from a family of 3 sisters and served as a registered nurse in Brussels during the war prior to the Allied landings in advance on Nazi-occupied Europe. In December of 1944, she returned home to Bastogne to visit her parents and became stuck after the German launched the Ardennes Forest campaign. She is shown working with a Congolese nurse shown that is called Anna in the show, but in real life, the woman was named Augusta Chevet. So she's actually the black nurse that she's working with that's Congolese, which means she's from the Congo. She was actually a real character, a real person in real life. Her name wasn't Anna, though. But like we said, it was Augusta Chevet. Together, they worked and volunteered during the siege of at the American 20th Armored Infantry Battalion aid station under Dr. Jack Pryor, the unit surgeon. And they were highly praised by Dr. Pryor, who made statements about her being so dedicated to the task of healing and comforting the many wounded Allied injured that it was enough to keep him to remember her and him to mention her in years past. We'll learn more as we jump into the episode, but first what's happening is the establishment of the situation that they're in. Nick, why don't you talk to us about how they set up the situation? As we know, in the end of the last episode, they arrive at the departure point for the Battle of Ardennes. They get called out of where they're at in Belgium, and they get pushed forward to right outside the city of Bastogne at the Ardennes Forest. So what happens is, what's going on right now in the beginning of the episode?
Yep, they were sent there with no real winter gear and not much ammo. They were not very prepared for it, and to make things even worse, when they show up, they see a whole group of soldiers returning from the battle, and they look very, very worn down. And I don't know if you remember the actor who plays the soldier who tells them about how bad it is, but that was Mr. Jimmy Fallon.
Yeah, Jimmy Fallon drives up on the Jeep at the end of the episode, and he's running around. It's really odd. I thought it was odd to see somebody who was made famous by being on Saturday Night Live and known to be a comedian to come out there and play, although it was small, a very pivotal role in the end of that episode.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not too sure how good his acting was, but I'll give him a pass on that.
No, he was Jimmy Fallon playing Jimmy Fallon. Which he's really good at impersonations, and I've never really seen him do any serious acting. And then, like I said, I don't want to take it away from him. He was in the show, I wasn't. But yeah, I get what you're saying. It was like Jimmy Fallon playing the serious role in a Saturday Night Live sketch, almost.
Yep. So yeah, they find out that the Battle of the Bulge was underway. I'm sure most of the listeners have heard a lot about the Battle of the Bulge, but the Allied forces are completely surrounded by the German army.
Yeah, it was a really in the history of warfare, it's one of the most interesting aspects of any long-term battles or anything like that. For those of you who don't know, let me go ahead and illuminate you. The Battle of the Bulge, which lasted from 16 December 1944 to 25 January 1945, was the last major German offensive campaign of the Western Front during World War II. It was launched through the densely forested Ardennes regions of Wallonia. I'm going to say Wallonia. If there's Dutch speakers out there who think it's something else, start a podcast. Tell me I'm wrong. Other than that, it's Wallonia for our purposes. But anyway, the forested Ardennes region of the Wallonia in eastern Belgium, northern France, northeast France, and Luxembourg. The surprise attack caught all the Allied forces completely off guard. American forces bore the brunt of the attack and incurred the highest casualties of any operation during the war. The battle also severely depleted German armored forces, and they were largely unable to replace them. German personnel and later Luftwaffe aircraft in the concluding stages of the engagement also sustained heavy losses. The Germans officially referred to the offenses as the, and here we go, Unternehmen Wacht on Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, while the Allies designated it as the Ardennes counteroffensive. The phrase Battle of the Bulge was coined by contemporary press to describe the Bulge in the German front lines on wartime news maps, and it became the most widely used name for the battle. The German offensive was intended to stop Allied use of the Belgian port of Antwerp and to split the Allied lines, allowing the Germans to encircle and destroy 4 Allied armies and force the Western Allies to negotiate a peace treaty with the Axis powers in their favor. Once that was accomplished, the German dictator Adolf Hitler believed he could fully concentrate on the Soviets on the Eastern Front. The offensive was planned by the German forces in utmost secrecy, with minimal radio traffic and movements of troops and equipment under cover of darkness. Intercepted German communications indicating a substantial German offensives were not acted upon by the Allies. So the Allies kind of knew this might have been coming, but they didn't act upon it because they thought maybe it was some kind of a feint or counterintelligence operation. The Germans achieved total surprise in the morning of 16 December 1944 due to a combination of Allied overconfidence, preoccupation with Allied offensive plans, and poor aerial reconnaissance. The Germans attacked a weakly defending section of the Allied line. Taking advantage of heavily overcast weather conditions that grounded the Allies' overwhelming superior air forces, fierce resistance on the northern shoulder of the offensive around the Eisenborn Ridge and the south around Bastogne blocked German access to key roads to the northwest and the northeast. Which they counted on for success. Columns of armor and infantry that were supposed to advance along the parallel routes found themselves on the same roads. This and terrain that favored the defenders threw the Germans' advance behind schedule and allowed the Allies to reinforce the thinly placed troops. Improved weather conditions permitted air attacks on German forces and supply lines, which then sealed the failure of the offensive. In the wake of the defeat, many experienced German units were left severely depleted of men and equipment as survivors retreated into the defenses of the Siegfried Line. The Germans' initial attack involved 406,000 men, 1,214 tanks, tank destroyers, and assault guns, and 4,224 artillery pieces. These were reinforced a couple of weeks later, bringing the offensive total strength to around 450,000 troops, 1,500 tanks, and between 67,000 and 125,000 of their men were killed, missing, or wounded in action during this offensive. For the Americans, out of the 610,000 troops involved in the battle, 89,000 were casualties. While some sources report that up to 19,000 were killed, Eisenhower's personal chief put the number at about 8,600. British historian Anthony Beevor reports the number killed as 8,407. It was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. The show mentions the Battle of the Bulge, but only briefly, and I feel it is not made a point of reinforcement. This was the first of 2 episodes that are on the battle, so I feel it gives a great visual and emotional picture of the situation. But for the amateur or ignorant historian or viewer, they're not properly made clear, as only paratroopers are familiar with the names like Ardennes and Bastogne. These are legendary names, and they're actually landmarks on Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and they're there in honor of the events of the Battle of the Bulge. The Bulge term, as we said, came from the deepest part of the line of Allied advance that the surprised German forces were able to encircle and form a visual bulge. If you looked on the maps, guys, and if you look on maps of the battle line at this time, up by Belgium, there is this, if you drew a straight line down, there would be a belly hanging out. And that belly was the bulge they were talking about. And this bulge pushed deep into Allied-held territory. And it was an all-out effort by the Germans to try to stop the onslaught of the war. I think it was not only the most bloodiest battle and the hardest battle fought by the Americans, but it's also the one I think sealed the fate of the Germans, because they really were getting their asses handed to them by the Russians on the Eastern Front. And this really just pushed it into it pushed all their effort and broke the will of the Nazi command. Everyone but Hitler. Hitler was completely convinced he was going to win the war up until he wasn't. So this was the big one. Let's talk about the visuals of the show. I mean, I see in the show they do a really good job of there's not as much lighting used in it. It's very almost grayscale or Senescaled. The episode, there's a lot of color that's missing from the episode, except for obviously blood. I think that was done on purpose to really drive home the bleakness of the situation. Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, that's one thing that really got me about the episode, was it really made you feel like you were there. The snow everywhere that muffled all the sounds, the fog in the air that made it so you couldn't see more than about 50 feet in front of you. I could only imagine what they were going through in that forest.
Yeah, I tell people all the time that I've been cold, I've been wet, I've been tired, I've been all those things. In Afghanistan, up in the mountainous regions on one of my deployments, I was in snow and all like, and I watched this episode and I cannot fathom the situation these guys were in.
Yeah, we actually see Captain Winters breaking through the ice in an ammo can so that he can shave his face while he's debriefing.
Every time I see that, and look, I don't not believe that happened. I absolutely believe he did that. He seemed like the kind of guy who would do that. But every time I see it, I'm like, why? Why are you? I mean, and then you read into it, and you have to kind of understand that these guys are living in holes in the ground. They're being mortared and artilleried every single day. They're very close to the German lines. I mean, we're talking about 100 meters. Sometimes the lines even crossed over themselves, and you see that in the episodes. So some people walk into each other's, fighting positions and stuff.
Yeah, that is shown. It's shown right off the bat when Roe accidentally walks.
Yeah, Roe walks into the open field, which was the famous field that the Christmas soccer game happened on, which they don't show in this episode, but it would have been nice to see there was actually a Christmas Day soccer game that was held between Americans and German lines at one point in the war. We'll go into that in a couple minutes. I'll talk about that more in depth because it's very interesting. But that's where that was. That's where he supposedly walked out. And he was walking to go find somebody and just walks out and realizes that he's wide open in the open. And the Germans are probably, if they were paying attention, would have shot him and killed him.
Yeah, and then a little bit later on, a German wanders into their camp.
Right, almost immediately after, because he walks back. And as guys, what we're talking about is the opening scene of the show. You just see you kind of see Doc Rose just kind of roaming around, not paying attention, and he walks almost into the German lines and then quickly retreats back to his line, finds Captain Winters, who's breaking open the ice. And as we said, the reason why he's breaking open the ice and shaving guys is when you're in that kind of situation and you haven't had something like a shower, a hot meal, or something like that, anything you can do to make yourself feel more like you're part of modern humanity, something as simple as shaving, is something that guys like that did that just so they can try to get a little feel of like, I'm normal. I'm not, not everyone's a bearded maniac like I am. Some people like being clean shaven, and he felt dirty, he felt nasty, and he was willing to break up ice chunks to do it. But as he's doing that, in walks Roe, and Roe's like talking to him about, I'm trying to find some gear, and we'll get into what he's looking for in a second. But then up goes Winter's hand because he hears something, and a friggin' German walks up to go piss on a tree, like right there by him. And this was the problem with what was going on. These guys were like, I mean, there's probably moments where in the nighttime, as they're moving from foxhole to foxhole, they probably walked right by each other.
Yeah, and the really interesting part of that scene for me was that they searched the German soldier, of course, and they find one bandage on it. And, you think, okay, what are they going to do with one bandage? Winters immediately pulls his bandage and gives it to Roe to use in the field because they are that short on supplies.
Right, and that's what Roe was doing at the time. Is Roe's running around trying to restock on medical gear. And for those of you who don't know, let me explain to you why that was such a well-placed part of an infantry platoon. So you have your line medic in an infantry platoon, and he's got his aid bag, and he's got all of his stuff. And then each soldier carries what's called a blowout pack, or an injury pack. And inside that injury pack, they'll have one IV bag, one set of IV, a needle, the tubing, all that kind of stuff. They'll have a compression bandage, maybe some ace wraps, maybe some gauze, and probably a morphine syringe. And that'll be in every single soldier carries that with them. And it's not for that soldier to use, believe it or not. They use them, and they're fine to use them. But that's not what the intent for those are. The intent for those is so that when the medic needs to restock in certain situations, he can go to those guys and collect up that stuff and be like, hey, I need this, I need that from you, and to restock my stuff because I'm the one who's treating everybody. And that's exactly what Roe was doing at that time. He was going around to collect up this stuff. And there's something that, again, this is another really well-placed writer and producer research thing. He's trying to find a pair of scissors like nobody's business. That's accurate, because every medic has to. You'll never find. You can always identify a medic in a company by their bandage scissors that are hanging in their gear. You need to have that with you at all times as a medic, at all times. And he had lost his somehow, and he was running around looking for him. And so that was something they go back and forth to. And when he finally gets a pair, you see that scene. He's so damn happy to have them because he knows he needs them. As a medic, Grow had a view of the war that none other men in Easy Company had. He became close to the other men, and he had to wonder at times if they would die. And if he would watch these guys he got close to die, and if they would die in his care. There's a very early part of the show where they talk about he's going around to everyone, and he calls everyone by their last name. He doesn't call anyone by their nicknames. Everyone's by their last name. And they have those guys who are like, hey, Doc, how come you never call me Babe? I think Babe Heffron's the big one. He's like, how come you never call me Babe? How come you always just call me Heffron? He doesn't go into it, but I'll tell you what's going on with him. You can't get he's trying to separate himself from being emotionally friendly with these guys, because his job is to interact with these guys at the times when they are dying, when they're bleeding to death, and when they're doing all the things that when you see them in movies that really turn your stomach, like, crying out for their mothers and crying and all this kind of, this is when he has to deal with these guys. And I'll tell you what, you cannot emotionally last very long in a combat environment when the people that you become friendly with and are your friends start dying in your own care a lot. So that is why Doc Rowe is the way he is.
Hey, what do you call those people again? Those Cajun healers.
Traiteurs. You know, my grandma was a traiteuse.
Your grandmother?
Uh-huh.
No shit.
Well, she was. Laid her hands on people and cured them. Took away sickness, cancer, you name it.
Your grandma did that? You're shitting me.
I remember she used to pray a lot.
Yeah, I guess she had to.
Talked to God about the pain she pulled out. Asked him to carry it away. That's what she did.
Jeez. I'm still trying to figure whether to pick me for a medic. God knows. Snap of a finger. Just like that, you're a medic. I've had enough plan, Doctor. Hey, how about you?
Yeah, that's also why he's isolated himself so much from the group. He sits in his own foxhole. He seems very robotic and distant.
Right, and they do a very good job of pointing that out with him. And it is not something that is just bad acting, or something that is done to explain why he's not seen in a lot of shows. This is something that a lot of medics do. They do isolate themselves. He won't even okay, so he's a senior line medic in the company, which means that each platoon in the company has a medic, and he is the one that is the boss of those guys, and he's responsible for the company as a whole. And you see him go to the other line medics, and they're both in the holes together as he goes and visits them, but he's not with them. He always goes off to his own little hole and sits there. So he's really expanded this isolationist attitude of medics to the extreme. And it probably has a lot to do with the fact that him being there from the very beginning, he's seen a lot of these guys die, and it's got to make a big deal on his mentality and his mental state.
Yeah, and actually he gets a little talking to from
Lieutenant Dyke.
I'm talking about when there's two of them in the same foxhole.
Yeah, Lieutenant Dyke walks up and he finds two of them in the same foxhole, and he's like, two medics in the same hole? What is this? What happens if an artillery round lands on you? Who's going to fix you up? Man, it kills you because he's right. He's absolutely right. But then he follows it up with turning to the first sergeant who walks up, and he's like, First Sergeant, where's my foxhole? It's like, you fucking idiot. You're over here giving these guys shit and giving them a good point, and you don't even know where your own foxhole is. And we'll go into Lieutenant Dyke next episode. This guy is he is the comic relief and the butt of jokes. As much as Sobel is the guy in the beginning that you hate because he's so hard, this guy you hate because he's just so sorry, forgive me, but he's so fucking out of it, man. I mean, there's something going on. It's like the lights are on, but nobody's home with Lieutenant Dyke, and yeah, we'll go into him more. But he's got a bit of an issue. There's scenes they show a lot of characters in this show that are just interacting with Ro in small little pieces, and one of those is the very first battle that Sergeant Martin takes guys out onto. I want to talk about how he becomes friendly with one of the privates. This is the guy that you talked to me about offline before we recorded, the one who admitted he was a virgin. And he wants to go with him on this patrol, Sergeant Martin and these guys. And Sergeant Martin doesn't want him to go. Sergeant Martin can already see the wearing and tearing on Eugene Rowe and how it's affecting him. And then why don't we go ahead and talk about what happens when the patrol goes out and they leave Rowe behind.
Yeah, Private Julian was his name. And as you mentioned, we find out earlier in the episode that he's actually a virgin. I think he's there to show how inexperienced these guys are.
Just how young they are.
Some of them, and how they have their whole lives ahead of them, and how some of them are just not going to make it. And Doc Rowe is the one who has to deal with that.
Right.
Yeah.
And you see him and Martin, they go off on this patrol, and they do show snippets of what's going on in Martin's patrol, but since this is done the producer and the cinematographer do such a good job of making this show from Rowe's point of view that there's that whole scene where Rowe is sitting against a tree, and he's watching into the fog.
Yep, and he cannot even see what's going on. He can hear the fire.
Yeah, he can hear them yelling. He hears the gun rounds going off, but he wants to get. You can see he wants to get up and run out there.
Yep, exactly. And the other guys with Sergeant Martin's wanted to get Julian too, but they were unable to, and they had to leave him behind.
I think it's actually, isn't it? It's Babe Heffron, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
And he's wanting to because what happens is Julian gets shot through the neck. I think he gets shot through the neck.
Yep, exactly.
And he was the walking point on the patrol, and he drops. The amount of fire they're taking, they can't get to him, and Martin's got to make a decision to pull the entire squad back to avoid more. Heffron does not take it well.
No, not at all.
No, not at all. And I don't blame him.
Later that him and Julian had a deal that if either of them were killed in combat, that the other would return all of their belongings back home. So the fact that they were unable to retrieve his body is really hard for Babe.
Yeah, and that's where you start to see, I think, the exterior, the hard, cold exterior of Eugene Rowe crack, because Eugene really did like those guys. And he sees that Babe he realizes as a medic, his job is not just to take care of them physically, but to take care of them emotionally too when they need it. And he does a very good job of getting in the hole. And he has this moment where he's very attuned and attentive to Babe Heffron's emotional state. But it's taking its toll on Babe Heffron or on Doc Rowe, and Doc Rowe is seen by Winters, and so Winters tells him, "Hey, I want you to go back and take." Another guy gets wounded doing something, and he's got to get taken back, and he sends him back to Bastogne, and so everything from this point forward, either speculation or just outright creative license, because we get to see Renee, the nurse. Being a non-military person, I want you to talk about what is it that struck you about when Doc Rowe goes back and he meets the nurse Renee and he interacts with her. What are some of the things that you saw and some of the takeaways that you saw in that were just really that stood out to you?
Well, what really stood out to me is that Rowe finally gets a chance to separate himself from the war zone. He gets a little bit of human interaction that he might get in normal life. And even though, as you said, it's a little bit of would you say creative
license?
It's a little bit of creative license by the producers. It really lends to show how different these guys have to be when they're in the war zone, as opposed to when they're in their normal civilian life.
Yeah, at first, I think he's struck at first by how matter of fact and professional she is. You got to understand that coming from the United States at the time, a lot of these guys didn't see Rosie the Riveter. We see it now. We knew that when the Greatest Generation all got packed up and sent off to war, that women had stepped up to fill the roles that men had filled in the United States, and it really was a very important time for women's lib and women's liberation for them to have that, because there was a lot of things they did that nobody thought they would be able to do. and they took charge and they handled things. And you see it all the time. Even movies like A League of Their Own. It shows you these women are asked to do something that men do, and then when the men come back, they're going to be sent back and expected not to do it anymore. But I think that guys like him saw something in that female nurse that he just didn't see. She wasn't helpless. She was in charge. She ran that. She would talk to the doctor the same way she was talking to the other nurses, and she talked to Eugene like, "Hey, this is the way things are." And he's like, "Well, I need this, and that," and she gave it to him. And then they have the whole scene where they're sitting outside, and she gives him some chocolate. That was what he takes back with him and brings back to Babe Heffron, is this chocolate.
Where did she come from? The black girl.
The Congo.
How'd she get here?
Just like me. She came to help. Chocolat? What?
Your hands.
My hands?
Mm-hmm. You're a good nurse.
No. I never want to treat another wounded man again. I'd rather work in a butcher's shop.
But your touch calms people. That's a gift from God.
No, it's not a gift. God would never give such a painful thing.
Nerd! Nerd! We need some help over here! Guys, traveling through the stomach.
Oh, that is it. Okay, get this one in first.
So her care and interaction with the soldiers and the wounded extended far past just the raid station, because he takes that stuff back with him to the front lines and takes it to Babe Heffron, and that's where he first calls him Babe, is when they're inside that hole together.
Yeah, exactly. And then just to show how bad it is on Roe, we end up losing the nurse as well.
Yeah. So Roe rushes back to Bastogne with wounded transport after another attack, and he sees the hospital that was set up in the village church. It was hit by German artillery bombardment. He's unable to find Renee in the wreckage, but he does find her bandana. So one of the things, all right, so this episode reminded me a lot of Schindler's List. And what I mean by that is not the obviously concentration camp story, but in the movie Schindler's List, there is only one thing that's colored in the entire movie, and that is the one little girl's pink jacket. Have you seen Schindler's List?
It's been a while, but yes.
Yeah. So you see this girl's pink jacket throughout, and every time you see her walking around in this pink jacket, it stands out, and there's something about it that's important. And then not till the very end, when Schindler is seeing them clean up all the dead bodies, you see the pink jacket in the pile with the girl in it, and it finally strikes you as that's why. So in all of the dull coloring of this episode, Renee's she has a bandana in her hair that's bright blue, and it stands out. It's very, very poignant, and so when he gets back to the church and he's looking through the rubble, and this is a true story because she did die in a bombardment attack, and she died a hero because she kept running in to the building trying to pull out more and more of the wounded, and then finally she went in and it collapsed finally on top of everybody. She was killed in it, and so there's no evidence to say that Eugene did what we see in the episode. Like I said, we don't even know if they met. But he looks in the pile and he sees the blue bandana, and he knows at that point that she is gone and that she has died. That this civilian, this nurse who wasn't even, she was from Brussels. She was visiting her family when all this happened and decided to stay and treat people. That she was killed, and he takes that blue bandana, and he puts it in his pocket. He heads back to Easy Company with it. Now, one of the things about the episode that's also very, very evident is that combat wounds were not the only thing that poor Eugenio had to deal with. There was all kinds of other stuff going on. You remember a lot of the other injuries that he's shown treating and dealing with?
Oh yeah, there was a whole bunch of frostbite, which I can imagine being in that snow. There was jungle rot because they had to leave their shoes on all the time.
Right.
The Bill Grandiers, his urinary tract infection. That's the running joke.
Gonorrhea. They call him. We said it before in the other episodes, but every time they make a joke about Garnier and they say gonorrhea, they just reinforce it. And there's a whole scene. Hey Doc, I'm pissing razor blades here, and he's like,
drink more water.
Drink more water. He goes, it's drink water. It's the pissing that hurts. And he's like, hey, can't treat it without penicillin, man. And we don't have penicillin. And even if we did, we have to save it to give that one anaphylactic, and here's the medic the one anaphylactic dose of antibiotics during a gunshot wound. Or not anaphylactic, but one prophylactic dose of some kind of antibiotic during a gunshot wound. And so he has to say that stuff. And hey, man, your urinary tract infection isn't my problem. Maybe I'll get you some cranberry juice. Towards the end of the episode, as we start winding down, there is another person that gets injured, and I don't recall offhand who it was. But he's got to reach down into his pocket to pull out a bandage, and he pulls out her bandana.
Yeah, well, actually, Jeff, it was Babe Heffron.
It was Babe. Okay, so it's Babe. So there you go. Babe Heffron gets injured. Babe Heffron, who inadvertently had been treated by Renee through the chocolate and him bringing it back to him, and sitting down with him and realizing that he's got to reach out to these guys and be just a little bit more than just this robotic guy. And I think he learns that from Renee in the episode. She shows him that you've got to be compassionate. You've got to carry the burdens of the wounded for them because they're physically and mentally unable to. And so it's on you as a person who's there to ease pain, to also ease that mental pain. And so that's why I think that he learns that from her. And when he reaches down when Babe Heffron gets hurt and pulls out her blue bandana and uses that as the compression bandage, it pretty much comes full circle, man. And I think it's brilliant writing and a really good way to tell the story. What do you think?
Yeah, I think his relationship with Babe actually symbolizes what we all try to do with war. We try to not think of them as individual lives, try to think of them as casualties instead. But Ro learns that he can't do that. He's seeing it firsthand, and he can't separate that in his mind.
Yeah, it's that moment when he calls him Babe and doesn't think about it, and Babe Heffron's like, hey, you called me Babe, and he's like, I did, and he had that smile that comes on his face, where he realizes that this is as much for me as it is for them, for me to become friendly with these guys, because I need friends. This is a very lonely job, and I think it's a great learning lesson for him, and it's fantastic. And overall, man, I just love this episode. I think it's the episode I've seen the most. It's not my favorite episode, but it's one that I think because it hits me as a former medic to watch this guy go from suffering and struggling alone to realizing that he needs the guys at Easy Company just as much as anyone else needs him in that company.
Yeah, and the realistic interactions that he has with all his men. I have a feeling Dale Dye had a big part in this episode.
Oh, I'm sure he did, and I'm sure that we might hear him talk a little bit about it. It's also, in regards to the Battle of the Bulge, you have to realize that the Battle of the Bulge is a 2-episode battle in this series, this one and the next one. There's a reason for that. So we have the one at Day of Days is, they do the invasion. Replacements is when they're doing, Operation Market Garden. That's 1 episode covering the battle. The fact that there are 2 episodes covering this battle is not by mistake. It is to show the enormity and the impact of the Battle of the Bulge on these guys. This was, in my opinion, the most emotionally and significant impacted series of events on Easy Company as a whole. Not the crashing of their commander's plane during D-Day, not the separation and the replacement issues that happened during Market Garden. The Battle of the Bulge is the most impactful and significant emotional and physical event that happens to the men of Easy Company. That is a speculative, in my opinion, but that's what I think, and that's why I think it was given 2 episodes. Because as we know, who has seen all the episodes, this next episode that we're going to get into is going to be this next episode is my favorite episode. of all. Even though like I said, I've watched this one that we're talking about today more than any other episode. My favorite episode is the next one, and it is, and I know you've seen it. It's the most powerful episode as far as seeing what happens to these guys and the differences between Easy Company pre-Battle of the Bulge and what Easy Company becomes after the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, the show really separates itself right at that point. They start focusing on the individuals as opposed to the group.
Right. Yeah, and that's by design. Like I said, I think. So Nick, I want to thank you, man, for coming on. And I know that Conspiracy Geeks is not up and running yet; it's still in production. But it's gonna be some good stuff, man. I think I know you, and I know the other guy that's gonna be on the show with you. So I think it's gonna be fantastic and a fun episode, a fun show, dude. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. Thanks for having me as part of this. Excited to hear the rest of the show.
Oh yeah. We'll get it out there to you guys, and guys, if you want to find all the links and information on this show, it'll all be on the show notes link for this show. I want to thank again Nick for coming on, and a little not spoiler alert, but a little behind the scenes thing. And me and Nick are doing this at work. We're recording this while we were at work, and I, guys, am getting ready to leave. Talking to Nick here to go catch a plane to go to Kansas City. When I'm in Kansas City, I'll be at the Big Rip Brewing Company for a meetup with some other guys that have hosted this show, like Sam Culper and Brad Taylor. They're all going to be out there, and we're doing a big meetup out there. And this show will be released after that happens. So it's happening actually Saturday. You guys won't hear this show till next Wednesday. God forbid something happens and I disappear in Kansas City. This could be the last recording of me ever. So, cherish it, love it. Nick will cry, as will others, but I doubt it. I'll be back next week, and we'll get this released, and everything will be good. So, Nick, thanks a lot, buddy, and cue the music, and we'll catch all you guys next time on next episode of Lessons in Leadership, Band of Brothers.
Lessons in Leadership, Band of Brothers is a production of Changing Hearts and Minds, hosted by Jeff Adamick on the Change Your POV podcast network. You can find other amazing shows on the network by going over to changeyourpov.com. Huge thanks goes out to all the amazing guests featured in the episodes of this series. First, our very own network hosts, Eddie Lazary and Bennett Tanton, hosts of Change Your POV podcast and Attack Friday. Dwayne France, host of Headspace and Timing. Andrew McDowell, host of Neophyte in the Woods. And our newest host, Benjamin Loth, hosting a show releasing soon called Branding with Benjamin. Special thanks goes out to some amazing podcast hosts who have donated their time and opinions to the series. Sam Culper of Breakers Podcast, Brad Taylor of Sofa Kings Podcast, Nick Giglio of Conspiracy Geeks Podcast, and last but certainly not least, to the man who probably had the biggest role in making Band of Brothers the series that it is today, a staple amongst military ranks and revered by all who have worn the uniform. Here's a huge salute to you, Captain Dale Dye. Owner of Warriors Inc., Dale also has a new film in the making and is planning on using veterans to be part of the cast and crew. To learn more about this and to get the links to all of the podcasts and podcast hosts mentioned, head on over to changeyourpov.com/Band of Brothers, all one word. If you like this series, share it with someone you think would like it too. Thanks for listening, and in the words of Dick Winters, I thank God for seeing me through the day of days and prayed I would make it through D+1. I also promised that if some way I could get home again, I would find a nice, peaceful town and spend the rest of my life in peace.